Hey guys, and welcome back to Z3 Cubing. The Rubik's clock was released in 1988, and the event was first held at a cubing competition in 2003. Yet it wasn't until just a couple years ago that we actually got the first clock that turned halfway decent. This is the Qi magnetic clock, released in 2020, utilizing magnets for all the pins, as well as the clocks themselves, for a precise yet effortless feeling to the turning. However, at around the same time, ShengShou released their own magnetic clock. This one only utilized magnets in the pins, much like the mod that many people did to improve the Rubiks brand, so it was widely considered inferior to the Qi, just a much cheaper alternative. But ShengShou wasn't quite done with their clock lineup. You see, you can think of a normal clock as sort of like a 4-layered puzzle, because there's 4 pins and 4 wheels that you can spin, and so in typical ShengShou fashion, they ran with that idea and made clocks with different numbers of pins. These are the recently released 3-layer ShengShou clock with 3 pins and 3 wheels, and the 5-layer ShengShou clock with 5 pins and 5 wheels. But without further ado, let's go ahead and get these opened up and see what kind of craziness comes with having a multi-layered clock. And here we go. Each clock comes with a little bit of plastic as well as an instruction booklet. Let's toss those off to the side though, because hopefully we won't be needing them. But here we go. These clocks look about as crazy as I would have expected. This one isn't even solved out of the box. I have no idea how they're even going to turn, so solving them should definitely be a fun challenge. It is very funny though, just holding a very small clock in your hands and a very large clock in your hands. The sizes just feel so strange. Anyway, I did go ahead and buy the normal ShengShou clock just to finish off the collection, so while we're here, we might as well try out the turning. So right out of the box, it feels similar to a Broken and Rubiks brand. Those ones can start off turning really terrible and you have to do a bunch of work on them, but this one at least starts out pretty mediocre. Compared to the Rubiks, the clocks feel a little bit easier to spin, which is good, but the clicks definitely feel less defined, leading to sort of a mushy and imprecise feeling, which could also lead to a lot of clock ups. The pins, being magnetic, obviously feel pretty good. They take a little bit more force and have a little bit less travel than the Qi that I'm used to, but it's definitely an improvement over the Rubiks brand. I also noticed that the screws holding it together are very obviously loose, like not screwed in all the way, which seems kind of like a mistake from the factory, but I think that adjusting these screws is actually the accepted way to tension a clock, so it probably is intentional. Anyway, let's go ahead and scramble it up and do a quick solve. I'll sort of walk you through my thought process as I solve it, just as a preface for when I start solving the different size clocks later in the video. Okay, that should be nice and scrambled. Let's go ahead and begin with some inspection. I don't really see anything too good on this front side here. On the back side, we do have these 2 sort of edge clocks lined up, so I'll start with those. Let's begin in 3, 2, 1, and go. First thing I'm going to do is line up the center clock to match up with those 2 edges, and then I'm going to move over and match up another clock, and then match up the final edge clock, and then move everything to 12. So this is kind of like getting the cross on one side, a center, and all 4 edges all lined up. So now we flip it over and do the same thing on the other side. I'm just going to do my usual pin order, so I'm going to start by matching up that top one, then I'm going to do the one to the left here, then the one to the right, and then finally the one on the bottom. Now we have all those 5 lined up. And finally, before lining this side to 12, we can go ahead and match up all the corners. So I'm going to lift up 3 pins, and then basically just turn this side until we get one of them matched up, and then the next one matched up, and then the next one matched up, and finally the last one down here matched up. And then we can go ahead and align everything to 12, and now the clock is solved. If that seemed a little too fast, don't worry, I'm definitely going to be going a little bit slower on the other 2, but my final thoughts on the original 4-pin ShengShou clock is that, you know, it's fine. It's better than the Rubiks brand, but not nearly as good as the Qi. If you just want a clock, then for $11, sure, you can get this one. But if you ever want to get into speed solving at all, do yourself a favor and just get the $30 Qi. I promise you it is worth it. As always, these 2 puzzles will be linked in the description at thecubicle.com, and you can get 5% off anything from their store with discount code Z3Cubing. The same thing applies with these 2 clocks. So starting out with the 3-pin one, how does this clock even work? That's a great question, and I guess we're all about to find out together. So if all 3 pins are up, I would imagine turning one of these wheels spins all the clocks together. So let's try it out, and that is exactly what happens. Okay, now if we put one of these pins down, I would imagine that spinning one of these 2 wheels will now just spin these 5 clocks, leaving this one not moving. So let's try it out. And that is still what happens. Okay, and finally, if we just leave 1 pin up, I imagine turning this wheel will only spin the 3 adjacent clocks. Yep, just like that. So overall, this clock turns exactly like I expected. Of course, the way a clock works is that the corners are always locked together. So if it's facing one way on one side, it's always facing the same way on the other side. Same goes with all of these corners, facing those ways and facing the same ways. Whereas the edges are not locked together. So the 2 halves of one edge are free to be in whatever different positions they want to be. So far, everything seems to work just like I expected. Also, by the way, the turning is pretty similar to the normal clock. If anything, it's just a little bit better because there's less friction from having fewer pieces, but it still has a bit of that same mushiness and imprecise feeling as the normal clock. I will say though that the pins are different. They barely travel at all, which is kind of annoying because it's very hard to tell just at a glance which pins are up and which pins are down. It always feels like it's getting stuck, even though they are actually moving correctly. Anyway, let's go ahead and do a full scramble on this thing and then attempt to solve it. I imagine it'll be just like a normal clock, but who knows, there could be some weird tricks that come up. So I guess we don't really need inspection. I'm just going to begin by trying to line up these 3 edges on the front side. So I'm going to bring this 1 pin up and then line up this clock with this clock. And now using this pin, I'm going to line up those 2 with this one. And now using 2 of the pins, I'm going to move that up to 12. So now I have essentially the cross on one side. So now we can flip it over, and as long as we don't do any crazy moves, we shouldn't be able to mess that up. So I'm just going to bring one pin up and then try and match up this edge to this one like we did before. There we go. Now I'm going to match up these two to this one, just like that. And now that this cross is all lined up relative to each other, I'm going to do the same thing as on a normal clock, bring up one of these pins, and now line up these 3 pieces with one of these corners, just like that. And now I'm going to do it with another pin, like this, line up this corner, and finally the same thing with this corner, so line all those up. And now we can bring all the pins up, bring everything up to 12, and hopefully it will be solved. So yeah, if you can solve a normal clock, then this 3-pin one should be absolutely no problem to solve. For someone who can't solve a normal clock though, this would definitely be a good stepping stone. I think the fewer number of pieces, and the fact that there's no center clocks, would make the basic clock method a lot easier to understand, and so you could probably teach a non-cuber how to do this in 5 minutes or less. And hey, if you already do like clock, then for $10, why not get a little mini version? I really do like what ShengShou has done here, and I think I would recommend the 3-layer clock. Anyway, let's finally move on to the coolest part of the video, the 5-layer clock. This thing, like I said, is just absolutely massive. It feels crazy in your hands, and with 11 individual clock faces, well, it should be at least a little bit of an extra challenge over the original clock. So first up, again, let's check out how it turns. I imagine with all the pins up like this, turning any of the wheels will spin all the clocks the same direction, and sure enough, that's what it does. Now if we drop one of these, that should stop one of the clocks from moving. Yep, just like that. And now if we drop 2, that should drop all these 3. Exactly. And of course, you keep following the same pattern with 2 pins and just 1 pin. The thing that I'm curious about though is this upper clock. Of course, it does spin when you have this upper pin here raised, but what about one of these side pins? On a normal clock, it would make sense that having any pin raised and turning the adjacent wheel would spin the central clock, but it seems just a little bit too far away for that gear to engage. So let's try it out, and it does not. So it looks like the only gear that'll spin the central clock is this upper one, which is quite interesting. I'm trying to think how that would affect the solve, and yeah, I guess you just always want to start with the central clock and these 2 edges, and then you can move outward to the rest of the pieces. Now about the turning real quick, just like on the 3-pin version, the pins are nice and magnetic, but they still have that annoyingly short travel. It's very difficult just at a glance to see which ones are up and which ones are down. And if the smaller one turns proportionally better than the normal clock due to having fewer pieces and less friction, I would say that this one turns proportionally worse than the normal clock due to having more pieces and more friction. That is to say that other than the weird pins, these 3 clocks turn pretty similar and all seem to be designed identically. Anyway, let's go ahead and scramble it up and try out a solve. Okay, I think that was the most thought I've ever had to put into making sure I was scrambling something up properly. Anyway, let's go ahead and begin like I was saying with these 2 edges right here. So let's lift up this 1 pin here to move this clock to line up with that one, as well as this one to line up with that one. So now we can just lift up this upper pin and line up these 3 clocks here with this one right here. Now we can also lift up this one and match it up with this one over here. Lift up this one and match it up with the bottom one. And there we go. I think that's all of our front pieces correct. Let's go ahead and line that up with 12. Okay, so now we should be able to flip it over and do the same thing on the other side. So I'm just going to line up this edge right here with that central one, as well as this one right here with the central one. Now I'm going to lift up this upper pin, line that up with maybe this edge over here, and that also happened to line up with this one to the right. And so now we can lift up all these pins and bring that down to match up this bottom one. Okay, here we go. We have the cross once again. So now I'm going to lift up all but 1 pin here and basically line up everything to that corner right there. Do that with a different pin to line up this corner, just like that. Different pin for that corner. That one's already aligned. This corner. It's funny, when you have 4 pins up like this, there's so much play in the system between all the gears that if you're turning this wheel, you can see that this clock down here sort of lags behind this clock. So you do 1 turn, and this one's only just starting to move. So if you ever want to get this clock to a certain position, you sort of have to get it to where it needs to go, and then backtrack a little bit to get this one back to where it's supposed to be. Or alternatively, you can just avoid using the wheel on the very edge of all the pins that you have up, and instead use one of these middle ones. That will make things a lot more responsive. It's just funny that you start getting these problems with the clock so big. Anyway, back to solving the last piece. Let's bring all these down to match up with this corner, bring all the pins up, and bring them all to the top. Hopefully we didn't mess anything up. Yep, we have solved the clock. So yeah, as you just saw, if you can solve a normal clock, this one also isn't too much of a stretch, but it definitely would be a fun extra little challenge to add on top. It is $18, which might be a little bit much for just a fun novelty item that you might not solve all the time. But again, if you like the idea of it, I would definitely recommend this puzzle. And if you want to be the ultimate clock collector, like I guess I am now, it's just under $50 for all 3 matching ones, which I guess isn't too crazy. But yeah, these are definitely some fun clock novelties for the collectors out there. ShengShou is doing what they do best, which is making a bunch of variations of the same puzzle. The turning, again, is mediocre, nothing worthy of speed solving, but at least a little bit better than the Rubiks. Of course, if you just want your first clock and you want a good one, get the Chi, but this is a fun little lineup. Anyway, yeah, that's pretty much it. I really hope you all enjoyed, and I'll see you guys next time.